Chapter 4 of Mathilda. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corrie Samuel. Mathilda by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Chapter 4. Among our most assiduous visitors was a young man of rank, well informed and agreeable in his person. After we had spent a few weeks in London, his attentions towards me became marked, and his visits more frequent. I was too much taken up by my own occupations and feelings to attend much to this, and then indeed I hardly noticed more than the bare surface of events as they passed around me. But I now remember that my father was restless and uneasy whenever this person visited us, and when we talked together, watched us with the greatest apparent anxiety, although he himself maintained a profound silence. At length these obnoxious visits suddenly ceased altogether, but from that moment I must date the change of my father, a change that to remember makes me shudder, and then filled me with the deepest grief. There were no degrees which could break my fall from happiness to misery. It was as the stroke of lightning, sudden and entire. Alas, I now met frowns where before I had been welcomed only with smiles. He, my beloved father, shunned me, and either treated me with harshness or a more heart-breaking coldness. We took no more sweet counsel together, and when I tried to win him again to me, his anger and the terrible emotions that he exhibited drove me to silence and tears. And this was sudden. The day before we had passed alone together in the country. I remember we had talked of future travels that we should undertake together. There was an eager delight in our tones and gestures that could only spring from deep and mutual love joined to the most unrestrained confidence. And now, the next day, the next hour, I saw his brows contracted, his eyes fixed in sullen fierceness on the ground, and his voice, so gentle and so dear, made me shiver when he addressed me. Often, when my wandering fancy brought by its various images now consolation and now aggravation of grief to my heart, I have compared myself to Persephone, who was gaily and heedlessly gathering flowers on the sweet plain of Enna, when the king of hell snatched her away to the abodes of death and misery. Alas, I who so lately knew of naught but the joy of life, who had slept only to dream sweet dreams and awoke to incomparable happiness, I now passed my days and nights in tears. I who sought and had found joy in the love-breathing countenance of my father, now when I dared fix on him a supplicating look, it was ever answered by an angry frown. I dared not speak to him, and when sometimes I had worked up courage to meet him and to ask an explanation, one glance at his face, where a chaos of mighty passion seemed for ever struggling, made me tremble and shrink to silence. I was dashed down from heaven to earth as a silly sparrow when pounced on by a hawk. My eyes swam, and my head was bewildered by the sudden apparition of grief. Day after day passed, marked only by my complaints and my tears. Often I lifted my soul in vain prayer for a softer descent from joy to woe, or if that were denied me, that I might be allowed to die and fade for ever under the cruel blast that swept over me. For what should I do here, like a decaying flower, still withering under his bitter words, whose kindly heat should give my poor heart life? Sometimes I said to myself, this is an enchantment, and I must strive against it. My father is blinded by some malignant vision which I must remove. And then, like David, I would try music to win the evil spirit from him. And once, while singing, I lifted my eyes towards him and saw his fixed on me and filled with tears. All his muscles seemed relaxed to softness. I sprung towards him with a cry of joy, and would have thrown myself into his arms, but he pushed me roughly from him and left me. And even from this slight incident he contracted fresh gloom and an additional severity of manner. There are many incidents that I might relate which showed the diseased yet incomprehensible state of his mind, but I will mention one that occurred while we were in company with several other persons. On this occasion I chanced to say that I thought Mara the best of Alfieri's tragedies. As I said this, I chanced to cast my eyes on my father, and met his. For the first time the expression of those beloved eyes displeased me, and I saw with affright that his whole frame shook with some concealed emotion that in spite of his efforts half conquered him. As this tempest faded from his soul, he became melancholy and silent. Every day some new scene occurred and displayed in him a mind working, as it were, with an unknown horror that now he could master, but which at times threatened to overturn his reason, and to throw the bright seat of his intelligence into a perpetual chaos. I will not dwell longer than I need on these disastrous circumstances. I might waste days in describing how anxiously I watched every change of fleeting circumstance that promised better days, and with what despair I found that each effort of mine aggravated his seeming madness. To tell all my grief, I might as well attempt to count the tears that have fallen from these eyes, or every sigh that has torn my heart. I will be brief, for there is in all this a horror that will not bear many words, and I sink almost a second time to death while I recall these sad scenes to my memory. O my beloved father, indeed you made me miserable beyond all words, but how truly did I even then forgive you, and how entirely did you possess my whole heart while I endeavoured, as a rainbow gleams upon a cataract, to soften thy tremendous sorrows. Thus did this change come about. I seem perhaps to have dashed too suddenly into the description, but thus suddenly did it happen. In one sentence I have passed from the idea of unspeakable happiness to that of unspeakable grief, but they were thus closely linked together. We had remained 5 months in London, 3 of joy and 2 of sorrow. My father and I were now seldom alone, or if we were, he generally kept silence with his eyes fixed on the ground. The dark, full orbs, in which before I delighted to read all sweet and gentle feeling, shadowed from my sight by their lids and the long lashes that fringed them. When we were in company he affected gaiety, but I wept to hear his hollow laugh, begun by an empty smile, and often ending in a bitter sneer, such as never before this fatal period had wrinkled his lips. When others were there, he often spoke to me, and his eyes perpetually followed my slightest motion. His accents whenever he addressed me were cold and constrained, although his voice would tremble when he perceived that my full heart choked the answer to words proffered with a mien yet new to me. But days of peaceful melancholy were of rare occurrence. They were often broken in upon by gusts of passion that drove me as a weak boat on a stormy sea to seek a cove for shelter. But the winds blew from my native harbour, and I was cast far, far out, until shattered I perished, when the tempest had passed and the sea was apparently calm. I do not know that I can describe his emotions. Sometimes he only betrayed them by a word or gesture, and then retired to his chamber, and I crept as near it as I dared, and listened with fear to every sound, yet still more dreading a sudden silence, dreading I knew not what, but ever full of fear. It was after one tremendous day, when his eyes had glared on me like lightning, and his voice, sharp and broken, seemed unable to express the extent of his emotion, that in the evening